On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to the Brattle Theater. Tonight, I'm extremely pleased to have Ishmael Beah with us to present his novel, Radiance of Tomorrow.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. And I want to thank Harvard Bookstore for having me, and to all of you for making the time to be here. What I'm going to do is to speak a little bit about what led to the writing of the book and talk about the challenges that led to it. Thank you. I don't have my own book, so I have and then speak a little bit about what I try to do in this book, and what perhaps speak also about the differences between writing a nonfiction and deciding to write a fictional book, still set in the same context, if you will. When the first book came out, A Long Way Gone, and I was traveling for it, I began to realize that there was a significant interest in people's wanting to know about countries that have collapsed, what happens during war, when the bloodshed is there. But people did not really stop to think about what happens when all of that ends and people return. Why do they do that? And when they go home, what sort of nostalgia drives them back? What stories have they told their children, some who may not have experienced the war, who were born towards the end of the war? How do they begin to live with each other when they get back to these places? Because during the war, the culture, the community, the traditions are shaken in many ways, and some of them actually are destroyed. For example, young people, before the war, when you see somebody who was older than you, you respected them tremendously, and that's still there. But during the war, young people had a taste of power. Some of them were commanders, and they carried weapons, and they did whatever they could, and now they return to their towns, and they have to be children again. How do they do that? And how do elder people bring back the older traditions again and try to infuse that into the younger people also? What traditions do you form again? Is it really possible to go back to what their lives had been? And if not, what do they compromise? What do they choose to hold on to? And more importantly also, how do you really move towards the future when this past is very new and is still pulling at you? How do you preserve what means the most to you, what's there to you in this uncertain time of your life? How do you do all of these things? So all of these questions were pushing at me, and so I decided that I would write a novel to explore these things. The novel, of course, based on my observations about my own country in Sierra Leone, and also my own experiences of going back, seeing things, observing things, and of course, imagining a lot of things. So the main character that you meet in this novel that starts is based around my grandmother. I imagine what it would feel like for my grandmother to return to her village, and what that would feel and look like. So the first character, Mama Kadi, starts walking back and begins to clean up the town. And two other elders joined her, and they start to clean up, because after the war, during the war, when people were killed in the Civil War, nobody's going around and burying them. Everybody's running for their lives. So when you return to even your town, you have to clean up even the dead bodies and the bones to prepare that place to be livable again. The grasses have started growing in the houses because nobody was living there. So you have to even clean that. If you ever been in a ruin of a place that have been destroyed by anything, whether war, natural disasters, and people haven't lived in, the grass doesn't come into houses when people are living there. It's only when nobody's living there that it begins to make its way into it. As soon as people begin to live there and their spirit inhabit that place, it withdraws. So all of these things I wanted to talk about. But also for me, when I write also, particularly the landscape that this story was set in, I began to realize that even nature itself, I wanted nature in my writing to be another character. It's not just an onlooker to what's happening, because I grew up in a village, so I know when human beings behave and how their behavior corresponds to nature, and how nature, in return, what it does. For example, when this first character, Mama Kadi, is walking back to the town, she's walking, and her bare feet are giving life to the road, to the path, because the path has been waiting for that. It's missed the warmth of bare feet that will give it life, because otherwise it would not function. And this comes from my own experience in growing up, because when you walk on a path, just your bare feet, it creates that path every day, and so you have that place. But when you don't, the grass will begin to grow. But sometimes if you've done it for many years, even the plant will be reluctant to grow grasses in certain areas. Almost it becomes bald, waiting for something else to come. And also writing, I had to go back to my own, the languages in Sierra Leone that are very beautiful, very image-driven, very poetic, just the nature of the language itself, in particular my own mother tongue, which is Mende. For example, the way we describe things, you say a ball. In English, it will be a ball. And though the English language is wonderful in its own ways, it's not sufficient enough sometimes to try and find what I want to say. So that struggle to find the English equivalent is also what made this writing challenging but also rewarding for me. So a ball, fefete, that's what you say in Mende. And if you translate it properly, in my opinion, it will be a nest of air or a vessel that carries air. So if I were to say the children kicked around a nest of air or a vessel that carried air, all of a sudden the language is a bit different as opposed to saying the children kicked around a ball. So when I was writing, I had to play with a lot of these things. And when I was a boy, really, that's when even before I ever knew I could become a writer, this idea of finding a way to translate from the beauty and the intricacies of that language I already encountered when I was a boy. Because when I was a boy, I became one of the literate boys in my community. So I would read and write letters for people in my village. And I never went to school actually to become a writer, because back home, if you did that, your parents would probably take you out and send somebody else to school, say that you're not serious enough. So, I wanted to be an economist, but I actually started making lunch money and people cooking me rice and giving me things because I wrote letters for them. So to some extent, I had an inkling that it was something lucrative, a little bit about the writing process. But when I was a boy, so when people would come to you and they would ask you to write them letters, of course, I learned about the secrets of my culture, and some people, they would tell me things they would not tell anybody else, and to also read letters for them. So, for example, there was one instance when a woman came to me, a mother, and said, I want you to write a letter to my son who lives in the capital city. I want you to tell him that his mother, who was pregnant with him for 9 months, who labored and walked and went to the river to fetch water while I was pregnant with him, who was in labor with him for many, many, many hours, and when and just went on describing his mother, who first washed his pants when he shat in it, and she went on and on and on and on, that she wants him to come home. And so I'm listening to all of these things and I'm thinking to myself, all right, first of all, I don't want to embarrass the poor fellow to receive this letter. So I'm thinking to myself, okay. So I say, your mother really, really wants you to come home. You should come now, So as a young boy, I realized that, even though there's beauty in the language, sometimes you have to get to the point with it as well. Otherwise, it can go on, because that's the nature of the oral tradition as well. When you're telling a story to somebody, you are telling it to them orally. You're trying to capture their imagination so that you can bring them to that landscape, to the place, the feeling of that place, the smell, so that they can be there until you release them. So when I write, I also come at it with that same thing. Another example I will make, how you say night came suddenly, if you translate it, it means the sky rolled over and changed its sides. How you say, for example, somebody's thoughts are scattered. You said, your mind is an anthill filled with smoke. So if you picture it, right, if you put a firewood is smoke in it, into an anthill, all the ants start to run away, they scatter. So that shows, visually shows what it is that you're trying to say. So in this narrative, you have a lot of that. When I wrote nonfiction, I couldn't do a lot of this because I was trying to write it first as a boy. Growing up in that context, I was writing it just how I was as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy, so I went to write it in that voice. And also because people are very used to the idea of a singular truth, that sometimes when you write nonfiction, it becomes a bit difficult, right? Where I come from, we don't believe in singular truth. It's not that we don't think that truth is there. Truth is there, but it comes differently, right? For example, we are all here tonight. If we all go back and we all decide to render and to tell somebody what our experiences of here has been tonight, it will all be very different, but it will all be very truthful. Because when you experience something, we know that from our oral culture, you're not reacting to it based on what's happening in that moment. It's based on layers and layers of your experiences, of what you already know. For example, if a car goes past us, everybody will react to it differently. If it's a Peugeot, maybe you drove in the car with your father when you were a young boy in a Peugeot, your relationship is different. I may not have that relationship, you know? So, but if we all tell the truth, it'll be different. But what has happened over the years is that whenever you write, particularly journalists will try to always say, well, it's not true because what is the fact? Well, you there, and you always laugh. When you're a journalist, you insert yourself in a situation so you can write about it. So, of course, you come equipped with cameras and papers and, you know, all of the rest. But when you experience something, then you try to write about it. You rely on the best of your memory and the feeling of that time, you know. So when I was writing, because I didn't have those restrictions, I felt a bit freer to sort of just really delve into the beauty and the intricacies of the language itself, to create the oration, the word, but also the characters demanded it. The older people would speak like this, and sometimes the younger people would not, depending on where they are. If you're in the capital city in my country, in Freetown, and you're a Mende person from my tribe, from my language group, and you will speak in the capital city, your Mende will be slightly anglicized than if you were in your village. So, for example, if you're in the capital city and you were saying that I saw somebody with a bicycle, you will use the word bicycle, which is really English, bicycle. You know, but if you are in my village, you would not, because first of all, in my culture, in my tribe, a bicycle is a foreign introduction into our lives. So we don't have a word for it. The only word we have for it is the sound that it makes, particularly with the bell, because we have those old Phoenix Chinese bikes. So when you hit the bell, it goes giding. So you call the bicycle giding. So you make the sound of the bicycle, right? So you say, giding, which means the bicycle that's going. But if you're in the capital city, you say that some people, so you say, oh, bicycle, so, you know. Also, when you're telling a story, you make sounds sometimes that says more than the words could really capture. When you're telling a story and you're trying to say, and I grew up in this context, you're trying to say somebody was running. There are two ways to say how somebody runs. You can say, he or she ran, tuk, 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 tuk. Or he or she ran, kuju, 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 kuju. These two mean different times of the day, in a day. Tuk, tuk, tuk means during the day. Because during the day, other sounds are occurring. Birds are singing, somebody's doing this and that. So when somebody runs, their footsteps are not as heavy. They are lighter because of all the other sounds that are occurring. Now at night, when it's quieter, I'm sure you've experienced it, you probably didn't pay attention. If you're sleeping and somebody runs past your house, you can hear their footsteps much heavier. Kuju, 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 kuju. So hence that. So if somebody is telling a story and says that, and the person ran kuju, 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 you know it's nighttime, you know. So when I'm writing all of these things, I'm bringing that wisdom, that knowledge, and trying to infuse it in these characters, in the way they are trying to unfold in this narrative. So people trickle into this town called Imperi, and they start to live there, they clean up, they begin to live, and of course, other challenges come into their lives. And there's a teacher, there are two friends, Bockarie and Benjamin. One of them is trying to keep his family together, and they end up leaving Imperi and going to other parts of the country. So you get to see what's occurring in other places. There's also a lot of fun going on, even though there are difficulties. Because one point that I wanted to make, which is that oftentimes people would think, some people read this book and they will say, well, you call this book Radiance of Tomorrow, but, do you really think it has a happy ending? I don't know. I want you to read it and decide for yourself. And the reason why I will never write a story that has a happy la 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 ending where everybody's going and prancing in the sunlight and singing whatever song they sing when they are happy. Because for me, happiness in life and peace is not the absence of challenges. And I think oftentimes that's a mistake that most people make. That you come to a closure, it's happy. No, that's not possible. Every day of your life, you have a challenge. It could be small. Some may be bigger than others, but it's always there. In the midst of that, in the backdrop of that, you're still happy. You love each other. You create a family. You have moments of pure joy. That's what happiness is. So that's what I try to show this community trying to do, all of that, the strength that it takes to do all of that. So anyway, with that said, what I'm going to do is read a little bit to introduce you to some of these characters, and then I'm going to open it up to some questions. So the story starts, I'll read you the first. Chapter 1. It is the end, or maybe the beginning, of another story. Every story begins and ends with a woman, a mother, a grandmother, a girl, a child. Every story is a birth. She was the first to arrive where it seemed the wind no longer exhaled. Several miles from town, the trees had entangled one another. Their branches grew toward the ground, burying the leaves in the soil to blind their eyes, so the sun would not promise them tomorrow with its rays. It was only the path that was reluctant to cloak its surface completely with grasses, as though it anticipated it would soon end its starvation for the warmth of bare feet that gave it life. The long and winding paths were spoken of as snakes that one walked upon to encounter life or to arrive at the places where life lived. Like snakes, the paths were now ready to shed their old skins for new ones, and such occurrences take time with the necessary interruptions. Today, her feet began one of those interruptions. It may be that those whose years have many seasons are always the first to rekindle their broken friendship with the land, or it may just have happened that way. So that's the introduction of the first character in the book, Mama Kadi, who's walking. And now, to skip a little bit somewhere else, I'm going to read a little bit of just chapters 2 that explains to you a little bit about the arrival of other people in this community. And you get to see other characters as well. People had been away from Imperi for 7 long years. During that time, the days became drawn out as they waited, restlessly, to start living again. They had seen the fire of war lick their town so viciously that even when the war was said to be over, it took them over a year, and more for some, before they started thinking about returning home. It wasn't that they didn't want to go back. Rather, war had taught them not to trust what they heard on radios, through rumors, and for those who lived in the capital city, read in newspapers. They knew firsthand that the madness didn't cease immediately just because someone signed a peace accord or some useless ceremony honored those who were not close to the realities they had just proclaimed to have stopped with a signature. It would take months for fighters in the deep countryside to get the message, and even longer to believe in it. Those who returned were coming from refugee camps in the outskirts of cities and in neighboring countries where they had waited all these years in tarpaulin houses to go home or start life somewhere else. The waiting had no fixed end date. Every life seemed on hold. Nothing was sure in either direction. Everything was temporary, and yet it went on for years, no one wanting to accept that it could become permanent. We are permanently waiting for the temporary war that is nearing 10 years, that is nearing 10 years to end, a musician had said in a popular song. Some people couldn't wait in one place, so they wandered about, making themselves vulnerable to other exploitations, police brutality or mistreatment by employees, relatives, and friends for whom they worked in exchange for accommodation and meager earnings. Nothing had been easy for anyone. Children born toward the end of the war had no understanding of it. By the time they could form memories, the guns had silenced. And no one wanted to explain what had happened because they didn't want to remember. And they couldn't find the right words. There were other children, though, who had known only war since they were born in it. No matter how, they were all returning to Imperi. They began to arrive in groups when night gave birth to a day brighter than the previous one. Mama Kadi, Pa Moiwa, and Pa Kainesi had woken earlier than usual, before the crow of the only cock that had begun to announce the life of another day. They were resting from their daily tasks, sitting on the logs at the edge of the older part of town, watching the road, summoning those who hesitated to return. Today, this morning, The road spat out people from refugee camps, towns, villages, hiding places deep in the forest that had become homes, from wandering, and from many other places where the world now found their presence sour, and where they could no longer see the growth of their shadows. It began with about 10 people carrying small bundles wrapped with tarp or cloth. Their children, about 6 of them, all no more than 10 years old, walked beside them. They had been traveling for 2 days now, starting in a passenger vehicle for 5 hours and walking the rest of the way. Vehicles hadn't resumed their routes to Imperi. As they entered town, their pace slowed while their eyes ran ahead, surveying the bullet holes in walls, the dark spots where fire had licked with its red tongue, the grasses that had grown in the remains of what used to be homes. Their eyes would return to their children as an assurance to continue into the belly of their hometown. Their hesitations were in every part of their bodies, the way their arms were tightly tucked to their frames, their lips pulled in, their eyelids quickly closing and opening. But as they ventured into the town, they gradually relaxed, and one of the children, a young girl, whose face was clearly filled with another story she had heard of this place, asked her mother, "Where is the place you used to sit and hear stories, and is that happening tonight?" The mother's smiling face looked down upon her child, her palm cupping the little girl's face. She did not respond, but her arms began swinging freely to their natural rhythm, her body and stride now showing an ease that comforted the girl, who buried her sharp cheekbones in her mother's palm. Others came with plastic bags that the wind almost knocked out of their hands, revealing the bags near emptiness. They had walked the entire way, 3 days' journey, for those who could walk fast, as they had no money to pay for transportation. They came 2 or more at a time. No one said much, even though they knew one another from before. There were only acknowledgments in their eyes filled with fear that held the tongue from saying more. Now, one of the last few points I will make, and I'll open it up to questions, is that the return and learning to live together is one thing, but it's also learning to believe even in the way people had functioned before, and some of the same images that have now have different meanings. For example, before the war, a boy with a machete or a young man with a machete walking on a path, no one flinched or hesitated at all because it was a young man going to harvest something. Now, after the war, when people see that, they flinch a little bit. They don't trust in that anymore because that image reminds them of other things. So how do you learn to actually not flinch when you see that? How do you learn to trust in the care for your neighbor? So here you have an amputated person who returns, who has children that were also amputated. You have children who are trying to figure out why are these other children amputated. And you have people discovering different things on this landscape as they try to live their lives there. So the narrative follows all of them and what they're trying to do, the compromises and all of these things. I do hope that you read and I wanted to say something about where the title comes from, but I don't feel like I should because I want you to discover it. I don't want to give it away for you. But so I hope you will read and form your own opinions. In my tradition, what we say about stories is that you will see throughout this narrative is also stories are important to be told, but more importantly is that you have to pass them on so that they can live in others. That's the only way they're going to survive and live on. So that comes from my tradition. So when you tell somebody a story, you give ownership of that story to them, and they pass it on to somebody else and so forth. So it's not yours anymore. There's no ownership to story. So when you choose to read this book, it is yours. What you make of it, what you draw from it, whatever, how you want to insert it in your life, it's all yours. Now, I'm the one who wrote it, of course. So if you want certain clarifications, I would suggest some things, but that may not be what it is, really. It may be my own. So you discover things that I may not have even thought of when I wrote this book, but that's part of the sharing. That's part of the oral tradition. So with that said, thank you very much for being here tonight. And so now, if you have questions, please do ask, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you. So anybody has any question, I will do my best to rephrase it, but it's a pretty intimate space, yes. Where am I from in Sierra Leone? I'm from the south. I was born in Matrujong, and then I grew up around that area in the south, and in Kabati and Mogbemo and places like. Yes, actually, Matrujong is not too far from Bo. Bo is our sort of like our headquarters, if you will, besides Freetown. It's our regional or provincial headquarters. Yeah. So in Bo you find Mendes. Yeah, in Sierra Leone you have Mendes in the south, and then you have some in the east, closer to the Liberian border in Kailao. So I'm from the one of the Mendes from the southern part. Yeah. Ah, 63. I heard those were the good days. That's what when we were growing up, we used to be told that those were the great days when Sir Milton Magai, our first prime minister, used to ride a bicycle to work. That's what I was told by my grandfather. I'm not sure if it's true, but anyway. The country is very beautiful, and the people are strong and as you know, you probably tell your experiences from there. And we are coming back to what we had been. But I think there's a need, for everybody, wherever you're coming from, to infuse yourself with your own traditions and to believe in them. Because if you're not strengthened with your own traditions, then you will not even know how to borrow the best of others' tradition if you don't know yours. So in this narrative, I try to bring that to people so they can see not just the difficulties that we have, but also the beauty, the wisdom that it's also embedded in all of that. And that's why we're still around. Otherwise, we didn't have these things. As the elders will say, our backbones would have been broken a long time ago. But that strengthens us, yeah. Oh yes, I go back home quite often. Actually, one of the reasons why I'm here now is because of this book. Otherwise, I usually escape during the winter and go back and go back home. Because as long as I've lived here, I still kind of adjust to the cold weather. I don't think my African bones absolutely cannot take it. I've been back to many places around Sierra Leone, and my experiences there inform some of the things. But also, this book, there are other parts of this book that are informed by other places I've been on the African continent. For example, I do a work for UNICEF for children in armed conflict, particularly. So I spent a lot of time in Central African Republic last year, and the year before that, and everybody, if you read in the news, you know what's going on there now. So when I was there, that's actually where I completed this book. So in the midst of other things going on, I was finding time to write. So some of those experiences or things that I observed there came into this as well, and wherever else I was in the world, So yes. Mhm. Oh. So the question is, to rephrase it, about the role of local tradition in welcoming people who have been perpetrators in the war and are coming back to live within the communities. Well, my country, Sierra Leone, was one of those countries that some people hailed as one of the success stories of rehabilitation, and some people say absolutely not. So there are two different thinking on it. And I went through that process where you were removed from a fighting force, and then you were put into a rehabilitation center, and all of these things were done to you, and then you were taken to your village, and then people say to you, no, we can't accept you because we don't know whether you've recovered. We haven't performed our own traditional ceremonies to welcome you back into our community. And then everybody would say, why not? We rehabilitated the kid. He went through therapy, and they say, no, no, no. Because there are things that people do. It depends on where you're from, what part of the country you're from. There are ceremonies that you have to perform so that you can repair what has been broken in that community again. Because even before the war, we have a culture of repairing relationships. We don't have an idea of punitive measures. It's a very Western concept that came. So, for example, when I was a kid, if somebody stole somebody else's goat or food or livelihood, the punishment from the chief was you will spend 5 days with them or 10 days to brush their farm. Now, from an outsider, they will say, oh, that's not enough. But that's enough, because when you spend that time with somebody brushing their farm, you drink from the same cup of water with them, you eat from the same. So eventually you're going to talk about what happened. You're going to be like, so what's really happened, man, you know? And then you're going to repair that relationship, but genuinely, you know, and practically whatever needs to be done. So there are ceremonies like that. There are also secret societies in the country that sometimes plays a role in sort of that, to initiate young people into certain secret societies that teaches them, you know. Of course, the point of the secret society is that once you're part of it, you can't say anything about it, so that's all I can tell you. And so there are various traditions that are like that, you know. So people utilize that, but not in the capital city, I would say. It was deep in the countryside, and unfortunately, my critique in Sierra Leone is that some of the places deep in the country that were really devastated by the war, a majority of the people did not go there to work, you know, because they're so remote. So even though they are practicing those traditions, there's no record of it. The only thing I can tell you of is a young Sierra Leonean fellow, John Coker, who started doing what is called Fambul Talk, which means family talk, family discussion. People would sit around a bonfire and they would discuss, and somebody would get up and say, there's somebody in this audience who did this and that and that and that to me. And the person will get up and say, I'm the one who did that, and this is why. You know, sometimes there are little fights, somebody gets smacked here and there, but it's part of it, you know. But what happens is that the community solves its own problem there, and everybody hears it, is part of it, believes it, understands it, and accepts it, and then they move on, you know. So these things are occurring. It's actually doing it all over the country now. And this fellow used to work for the special court, and he was dissatisfied with what they did and actually started this local initiative. So that's what's recorded. But there are other things that happen. Yeah. Yes. Yes, please. Hello.
One thing I two chapters into the book now, and one thing that has struck me as most powerful in the narrator's voice is that I know your story and I know you lived your story, and so it's really moving me that you have the power to craft this fictional novel, you know, taking responsibility for what you have done in the memoirs of a boy soldier.
Yes.
And if you're able to, and I understand if you're not, I was hoping to maybe just talk a little bit about how that was a catharsis process for you, that you as a human being were able to get to this point where you became this narrative voice that's able to recognize the atrocities that you were involved in from the other side.
Yes. Well, when I was writing the nonfiction, I had the inkling from early on that I needed to write it as the boy who was in the war at the time, not as the young man who had come out of the war, because he won't be the same. You know, for example, when I was in the war, I didn't know the political situation that had really caused the war and the intricacies of it. So when you read A Long Way Gone, you had no discussion about politics. Because I was an 11-year-old kid, I wasn't discussing politics with anybody. You know, I didn't care. So, but yet, whatever happened, you know, it came into my life and did what it did. So when I was writing, I wrote from that voice. Now, writing this novel, I had to write from the perspective of different characters who I may have encountered and may have brought some of these things to that I was actually discussing. But that's the beauty of fiction, so I can imagine that. And I can also have a little bit of relationship because I know the other position, when I was bringing it to them, how they looked, what their faces were like, so I can render some of that. But I can also imagine a lot of it as well and create certain characters, create that world. And one big difference I would say, though, is that writing both nonfiction, and then the memoir and this book, is that with the nonfiction, sometimes I didn't want to write it when I was working on it because it's so difficult and emotionally charged for me and personal that I went to places that were very difficult I didn't want to go. With this, I couldn't wait to go into the world because I created the world. And I would go into it and I would decide who was going to go left or right, So it was very exciting for me, right? So that was very liberating for me. And I also created a distance enough to be able to do some of these things, So, for example, one of the characters, there's a character in this book, the most difficult one for me to write was a character called Cornell. He's a former child soldier who returns to this community as well, and he comes with others who are former child soldiers and some that have become his sort of makeshift family is formed, and he starts to live in this town, and how he conducts himself, and what he does for his people, and how he manages to maintain his own dignity. It was very difficult to write that character because I wanted to walk a fine line to show that this is somebody who doesn't allow anybody to trample on his dignity any longer because of his experiences in the war, but not endorsing violence. So it was a very funny line to walk for me to write that character. It was very difficult, because I didn't want people to interpret, well, that could be you. So you're saying that people should do this? I know. I was saying, it's fiction. It's a novel, Anyway, so those were the difficulties. But here, really, language was what was very intriguing for me. And also being in the shoes of different, being a grandmother, being an elder person, being an amputated person, and all of these things were quite, being a young student, being a young woman, one who had a child from the war, who doesn't really want to keep the child because it reminds, it brings other things, and all of these things. So I had to imagine all of these things, and it was challenging, but I liked the challenge a lot, Yeah. Yeah. Yes, you had a question. Yes, there was a conscious effort to think about certain things, but the way I write is this. I never sit down and sort of plot, what I want to write, particularly when I write fiction. I've written fiction before, but not a book length. But whenever I write fiction, I don't sit down and plot and see, okay, this is what happens and think about. What I do, I spend a lot of time thinking about the characters, their names, their age, their gender, and the landscape that they inhabit, and what language I can use to fit that landscape where they live. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And then once I start, the story just comes. And there are some areas that are familiar with me, things that I've observed. I'm also a very strong observer. So there's things that I've observed, people's mannerisms. So even when I'm writing, I mimic things. For example, if I want to say somebody was touching their hair, I will actually do the motion to see what does it really feel like so that I can write it properly. So when you read it, you can actually feel. Instead of just saying, he touches it, it's like, is that really how somebody would touch, and I would do it. Because oftentimes some actions that we do, it's part of our nature, we don't think about it. But when you want to render it in writing, you have to bring it in a way, So I do these things. So then I start writing, and then I start creating certain things. And certain characters, sometimes it's strange to say, but you almost feel like there's people are speaking through you, So sometimes I feel that way when I'm writing. I feel like something comes out and I look at it and be like, I'm not sure if I wrote that, but, it came from my fingers, so maybe, But there are certain things because you're in that world, And of course, I also go back to what I used to be like as a kid and hear some of those cadences, that sound, and that also infused me with a lot of things. But there are certain decisions that I make that are deliberate, and there are some that just occur organically on their own, Yeah. Yes.
You described the colorful language, the Mende language, but do you incorporate any Creole in your?
Yes, I was just making references to Mende particularly because that's my own language, my mother tongue. But, in Sierra Leone, there are many other languages, so I borrow from all of them, including Creole as well. And the way people say, and there's also slang. Also in Creole, particularly young people, the Creole evolves, right? So what is a slang today, what's acceptable today, in a month or so would no longer be spoken, So it changes. So you also have to keep up with the time. So I incorporated a lot of that into. Creole is spoken everywhere in the country, but more heavily in the cities and in the capital city, and then but it's spoken in many places. And a good number of people can understand it. But our Creole is not, is different. It's not the Haitian Creole, it's English Creole, spelled Krio. So there's some English in it, there have lots of different things in it. For example, in Creole, there are some Sierra Leoneans here, so if I make a mistake, you correct me. In Creole, you will say, when you say, how are you? Just to say, even in Creole, it's beautiful. You say, howdy body, which if you pay attention is asking, how is your body? Because that's really what you mean when you say, how are you, when you're asking somebody, right? So that's how we say, howdy body, And sometimes, for me, really, it's like I want us to take charge of telling our story, because sometimes the way we speak, if somebody else doesn't understand, it can be misinterpreted, and it will mean something completely different, People speak in parables. For example, they will say, our dog sleeps in the cooking area. Most people would not know what that means. Maybe some people probably start NGOs to save dogs, what have you, and all of this, right? But it actually means that you are hungry or your family is hungry. Because if you're in the countryside, particularly when you cook, the fire is on at the fireplace 24/7 because you cook fresh food. You go to the farm, you harvest something, you start cooking the beans in the morning, you cook everything, you pound the rice, or maybe you boil it a little bit. So if the place is warm, the fire is there, the coal is hot, the dog would not lay there. The dog will only burrow itself in the fireplace if it's being cold enough, which means that you haven't cooked for a while. So how do you render that, If somebody's not from there, you say that, because one time I actually I witnessed a situation in Sierra Leone where there was a journalist who was speaking. Whenever I'm home, I'm in my shorts and my flips, so I walk around. People don't know who I am. They know of my name, but they don't expect it's me. It's very strange. I like it, actually, because then I can be in there, So I was walking around, and then the kids were talking to some journalists, and they were saying, something. They were saying, "Would a gian dirty water they drink am?" Which means that we're giving you dirty water and you're drinking it, which means we're pulling your leg. But the guy did not understand, so he was writing, and I'm not joking. After a few months later, I was just researching Sierra Leone on Google and trying to see, and there was a line that says, in Sierra Leone, when they give you dirty water, you must drink it. And I'm thinking to myself, what? Absolutely not, because, the understanding had completely been missed, So now it was already in the mindset of I don't know how many people who have probably come to believe that this is the case. And they probably went to Sierra Leone and they decided to drink whatever they could find, and they got sick, and who knows what happened. This is my fictional side now, just going crazy in that sense. But you see these things and you realize that for me, that's why whatever I write, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, I always write as if it's the first and the last thing that I'll ever write in my life, with that urgency, that enthusiasm, but also with that dedication that we have to take charge of our own narrative and tell our own stories so we can prescribe our own dreams. We can even fail in our own ways, but we have to take charge of that. Because otherwise, if we grant that power and that opportunity to people, and they do it for us and they don't take the time to understand what we're really saying, who we are, then we have something really, we're not in charge of our future. Or even preserving our own traditions, So anyway, maybe I will still have some time. Take a few more questions if you have them. Yes.
Are you currently working on any projects to help
The question if I'm currently working on projects to help, yes, I'm always working on projects to help young people, not only in Sierra Leone. I have a foundation that I started after the first book came out. I gave money from the bookstore to give opportunities to young people, in Sierra Leone, to either go to school and do whatever, just opportunities, One of a friend of mine, Rai Barkot, who was an ex-Marine guy, he wrote this book and he has this quote in it that is really amazing, that I always repeat. He says, talent is universal. Opportunity is not. It's the only difference between who sits here and somebody else somewhere else, you know. So what I try to do in my capacity, and also with other Australians, so actually some in the audience here, we try to give opportunity to other young people, because I'm standing here because I was given that opportunity. If I had been left in the war, I didn't get a chance to go to school and do anything, I would not know that I was capable of some of the things that I'm doing now. So that's what I try to do. But on another capacity also, I try to do practical things with UNICEF as a UNICEF ambassador for children in armed conflict. I actually go to the war zones and try to negotiate the release of children from the fighting. So where people are carrying guns like I used to, and try to. And there have been instances where I've gone to some places where some of the commanders have read my first book, which I did not. That was in the audience I had in mind. Absolutely not. But that's happened. And it's actually something that's granted us access to them. And they say, oh, yeah, the guy who wrote that book, you gave away our secrets. So, and things like that. And then we can talk after that, you know. But so I do this sort of thing, you know, in my own capacity. I want to pass on the opportunity and create other people who also do that, so that, you know, who knows what the next writer could be in Central African Republic or in Colombia in the bushes, who could be doing some amazing thing that we all want to read, you know. So, yeah. Anyway, so I'm invested selfishly in that because I want to read great literature as well. So I want other people to write it. Yes. What is my occupation? Yes, I am author of, I am. I'm just joking. Yes, I am a writer. I consider myself a writer, but my background is also in political science. So that's really what I studied. In university, I never studied writing. I took some classes. And oftentimes when I teach writing, young people would ask me, so what is the one advice that you give us? I always tell them, don't study writing, study anything but writing. You know, study philosophy, do this, read a lot of books, study other things, study law, and then try to write it. See what you can do. But anyway, so I'm a political scientist by background, and then I'm a writer now full-time. Do some human rights advocacy stuff and things like that. And I actually intend to go back to school here to do a PhD in economics and development. So I'm not sure what side of my brain I'm going to find, but we'll see. I'm sure there's a room in there for something else, you know. Yes. Yes. That's a great question. The practical question is, when people return to rural places, how do they eat? Well, even before the war and before the reliance on imported food, people have, in Sierra Leone, we have a strong subsistence farming culture. So people will grow stuff, and they will eat. They will grow rice, actually very good rice, and they will grow other things. So usually when people are coming back, they bring one or two things. The most important thing could be salt. So if you have salt, you're pretty much good. Because then if you're in the countryside, you can go and set traps, which I talk about in the book, and catch animals, and then you can cook them. You can go in the ruins of old farms where maybe cassava is still growing, there are coconut trees, maybe guava trees, and things that have been left. You can begin to find something. And slowly, when more people return, then markets will start to come up with other goods that you may not be able to cultivate locally. But there are lots of things that you can cultivate locally in your village. And people also know how to preserve their food without using a refrigerator. As a kid, I think I only really knew how to use a refrigerator, or knew about it, when I moved to the United States. Right? So all my life, I grew up eating fresh. You want a banana, you pick it and you eat it from the tree. You know, so you don't go and find one. If you want a chicken, you run after one, you catch it, and you eat it. You know, it's as fresh as it can get. You know, so that's how, when people return, that's what happened. But of course, during the war, because people weren't farming, some of the crops, you know, either they died or something. So when people return, they go in the ruins of the farms and find things, and then maybe they will borrow crops from the next village, and they will grow something, and so on. So slowly they begin to build up, you know, the seed banks again and things like that. Yeah. One or two more questions, yes. Yes. Advice in terms of writing. When I started writing the first book a long way gone, it was actually, I never intended to publish it. I was never writing it for publication. I was writing it because, as a political science student and I was doing some internship at the UN, I didn't really like the discussions and the arguments that were being made about my country. So I was writing out of frustration to prepare myself to be able to get into an argument to succinctly say what I wanted to say. So my advice to you is that if you want to write about something that's very emotionally charged, don't write it for anybody. Write it first just for yourself without thinking anybody's going to read it, because then you're going to be honest with it more than you would if you know and you have in mind that you're writing it for this person or that person, because you may, whether you like it or not, human nature is like that, you will censor yourself very strongly. So write it for yourself. Encourage your students, write for yourself. Only when you feel like you need to share it, you share it. But write for yourself. Even when I write the memoir, I didn't think it would help me at all. But after writing, I realized that at the end of it, I actually learned things about myself that I didn't know. Because it was the first time that I allowed myself to actually go into my own experiences and observe it. Because when I was surviving the war, I was just trying to stay alive, so I didn't have time to think about it. I just did what I needed, So it's the first time that I actually got to meet myself in that exploration and learn that even within that difficulty, there are certain strengths. My character has been built a certain way that was positive that I never saw. Because even when I thought of it, the nightmares, I didn't want to go there. So that's what you should tell your students. If they can do that for themselves, and if they feel there's something that they really need to share, that they feel can benefit other people, then they can do that. They will discover that there is that benefit, but not to want to share with anybody. No. You've ever seen the film, the reference that I can make, anybody ever seen the film Freedom Writers? Yes. There's a scene, particularly where the teacher gives these notebooks to kids and says, write in it every day, write a diary, and if you want me to read it, you put it there. And then I can read it and I can give you feedback. And slowly they started putting it because they felt there was something they wanted to share. I think when you give somebody the power, not the power, when you let them know that they already have natural intelligence within them, that they just need to stop in it, and the teacher can spark it for them, and then they can discover it. That's all you can do. And then once you spark it, it would blaze. You can't stop it. So that you just need to find a way to spark it. But of course, that comes with trust. Because nobody's going to tell you. So even when I came, for therapy, when I would go to a therapy session and somebody would say to me, oh yeah, when I first came to the US, they would say to me, oh yeah, 1 hour. So how are you? Tell me. I was, I don't know you. Why don't you tell me about yourself? And they would say, we have 1 hour. So is that enough time for me to really tell you who I am? No. Because when you're coming from difficulty as a young child, you distrust everybody. Until somebody proves to you that they genuinely care, you're not going to let them in anyway at all. So teachers have to provide that. You know that already. I don't need to. So once they get that, and they will start to share. Also, another technique that I've found is to create fictional characters about their story. People will tell their story through fictional characters very well sometimes. And then at some point during the talk, they will give themselves away without even noticing. Because when you challenge, be like, oh, that person can't really do that. Well, I know because that person can really do that. I know that. And I name them. Okay. So, okay. One very last question. Let's see. Who are the two hands that were up? I'm going to select the woman. Sorry. Yes. How do I reboot it? Well, for me, the way I write, I never come to that place where I feel like I've lost the thread, because what I usually do is that I walk around longer, incubating, than sitting down and then writing and then losing it. So usually sometimes I walk around for a year thinking about a story, and people ask me, are you, well, yeah, I'm thinking about it. And if you are not a writer, sometimes people think this guy is not serious, you know. But I walk around for a year thinking about it with little notepad, making it. So I really think about it, and then when I sit down, then I will start. Now, when the first draft is over, then I will go back and read it. And for me, the way I do that, I will print it out. I can't do it on the computer. I'll print it out, and then I will mark it. And I will pretend that I know nothing about the subject matter. I'll really put myself in that and just start to really go through it, the fiction. And I'll start to go through it and really look at. And then I'll say, that character is not realistic enough, or that's not what, and then I'll build certain things. So that's how I work sometimes. But particularly when I was writing this book, I was in so many places where there wasn't a lack of inspiration. Wherever I was, you know, if anything, I didn't have the time to sit down and write. That was the difficulty. But there was never a moment where there was a lack of inspiration because of the places that I frequented when I was working on this. I mentioned earlier in Central African Republic, when I was there, I was working on this. You know, I would just go for a walk in the capital city, which, you know, there's lots of bad things going on there now, but at that time it was brewing. So I could see so many things that when I returned, you know, I had this time to sit down and write. And also because there was no internet there, you know, so that was really helpful. Internet came like 2 hours in a day from like 4 to 6, and that was it. So I was like, okay, great. So if there are any writers here looking for perfect location to write, I have a few in mind where you absolutely have no distractions, only inspiration, you know. But with that said, you know, seriously, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to sit there and sign some books for you and get to meet some of you. And some of you I already know from before, so thank you for coming. And it's been a pleasure talking to you.